The gravel crunched under my worn boots as I walked away from Sunset Ridge Ranch, with nothing but 2 crumpled dollar bills in my pocket. Behind me, Marcus and Janet screamed threats that would have terrified me 6 months ago. But what they didn't know was that every vicious word had been recorded by the device hidden in my late husband's old radio. The real ownership papers were buried where they'd never think to look, and the apparent helplessness they'd been counting on was about to become their complete destruction. As their voices faded into the Texas night, I smiled for the first time in years. They thought they were dealing with a broken old woman, but I was about to show them what 65 years of quiet observation could accomplish. My name is Alice, and for 43 years, I believed that being a good mother meant sacrificing everything for your children. That belief nearly cost me my life. Harold and I built Sunset Ridge Ranch from nothing back in 1978. 2,200 acres of prime Texas cattle land, rolling hills dotted with oak trees, and a main house that overlooked the most beautiful sunset you've ever seen. Harold chose the name, and I planted the rose garden that still blooms every spring. We thought we were building something to pass down through generations. Harold died 5 years ago in a tractor accident during spring roundup. One moment he was checking fence lines, the next moment the tractor rolled down an embankment. The paramedics said he died instantly, but I still wonder if he suffered. The funeral was the largest our little town of Cedar Valley had ever seen. Harold was respected, maybe even loved by everyone who knew him. After the burial, I discovered that my quiet, steady husband had been far more business savvy than I'd ever realized. The ranch was worth $8.5 million. The cattle operation generated steady income, and Harold had made smart investments over the years. For the first time in my life, I was wealthy and completely alone. Marcus is my eldest at 42. He inherited his father's broad shoulders, but none of his work ethic. By the time he turned 30, Marcus had burned through 3 different careers and 2 marriages. His current wife, Stephanie, was a sharp-tongued woman who made no secret of her belief that I was taking up space that rightfully belonged to them. Marcus had developed a gambling problem that grew worse each year. He'd disappear for weekends to the Indian casinos 3 hours away, always returning broke and desperate. Janet, 38, was my daughter who could have been anything she wanted. She was valedictorian of her high school class, got a scholarship to the University of Texas, and graduated with a business degree. But somewhere along the way, her ambition turned into bitterness. She went into real estate during the worst market crash in decades, then married and divorced a man who left her with nothing but debt. Janet had been living in an expensive apartment in Austin, driving a car she couldn't afford, maintaining a lifestyle that existed purely on credit cards. For the first year after Harold's death, both children visited regularly. They brought groceries, helped with paperwork, and seemed genuinely concerned about my well-being. Marcus would fix broken fence posts, and Janet would organize my medical appointments. I was grateful for their attention, thinking grief had finally brought our family closer together. But by the second year, their visits took on a different tone. Stephanie would walk through my house making comments about how much space I was wasting. Janet started bringing legal documents for me to just sign to make things easier. They began talking about how overwhelming the ranch must be for someone my age, how dangerous it was for me to live alone so far from town. I played along, pretending to be confused by financial matters. I let them think I was overwhelmed by the responsibility of managing such a large property. When they suggested I was getting forgetful, I didn't correct them. It seemed easier than fighting, and I suppose part of me enjoyed having their attention, even if the motivation was questionable. Marcus and Janet started coming and going as they pleased. They had keys to the house and treated it like their own. Slowly, their belongings began appearing in the spare bedrooms. Marcus's hunting rifles took up residence in Harold's study, and Janet's expensive clothes began filling the guest room closet. They ate my food, used my truck, and made decisions about ranch operations without consulting me. Small valuable items began disappearing. Harold's gold pocket watch vanished from the bedside table. My grandmother's silver candlesticks disappeared from the dining room. When I asked about them, Marcus claimed he'd moved them somewhere safe, and Janet suggested I was becoming paranoid. The transformation was so gradual that I almost missed it. The caring children who'd supported me through grief were replaced by calculating adults who saw me as an obstacle to their inheritance. But I wasn't as helpless as they believed. 3 months ago, I discovered something that changed everything. I found a small recording device hidden in my bedroom tucked behind the mirror on Harold's old dresser. The device was sophisticated, the kind used by private investigators or law enforcement. Marcus had been spying on my conversations with my lawyer and banker for weeks. They knew about every appointment, every phone call, every financial decision I was considering. That discovery opened my eyes to how carefully they'd been planning. This wasn't opportunistic greed. This was a calculated campaign to take control of everything Harold and I had built. And they'd been recording my private conversations to stay one step ahead of my defenses. The realization should have terrified me. Instead, it awakened something I'd kept buried for decades. If my children wanted to play games with a supposedly helpless old woman, they were about to discover that appearances could be very deceiving. The morning after I found the recording device, I began my own investigation. If Marcus and Janet were going to treat me like an enemy, I needed to understand the full scope of their plan. I started by going through Janet's purse while she was showering. Inside her leather portfolio, I found detailed notes written in her careful handwriting. The pages outlined a strategy that took my breath away with its cold calculation. They weren't just planning to steal my property. They intended to destroy my reputation, my independence, and possibly my life. The notes referenced multiple meetings with a lawyer named Bradley Hutchins, who apparently specialized in conservatorship cases. They'd researched the legal process for having someone declared mentally incompetent, including the medical evidence they'd need and the timeline for court proceedings. Janet had even practiced forging my signature on several documents with notes about which letters needed work to make the forgeries more convincing. Marcus owed $340,000 to casino loan sharks who'd already threatened his family. The notes included phone numbers for these men, along with Janet's observations about how desperate they were becoming. Stephanie had been researching inheritance laws and asset protection strategies. They'd identified a corrupt judge named Samuel Peters who would approve their conservatorship petition in exchange for the right compensation. But the medical deception was the most chilling discovery. For months, I'd been feeling unusually tired in the evenings, often falling asleep in my chair while watching television. I'd attributed this to age and grief, never suspecting that my own children were drugging me. The notes revealed they'd been crushing sleeping pills into my evening coffee, carefully controlling the dosage to make me appear confused and elderly without causing obvious harm. Dr. Williamson, our family physician for 20 years, had been receiving monthly payments from Marcus. In exchange, he'd been creating false medical reports claiming I showed signs of early dementia. The notes included copies of these fabricated reports, complete with observations about my alleged confusion and memory problems. These documents were intended to support their incompetency filing when the time came. The conspiracy extended further than I'd imagined. Thomas Morrison, the president of our local bank, was being bribed to provide information about my accounts and to freeze my assets once the conservatorship paperwork was filed. They'd identified which of my neighbors might testify about my supposed declining mental state, and Janet had been cultivating relationships with these potential witnesses for months. Even more disturbing, Derek, Janet's ex-husband, was secretly helping them. Despite their bitter divorce, Derek wanted revenge against Janet, but was willing to help destroy me first. He'd been providing legal advice and had connections to unethical lawyers who specialized in elder fraud. I realized I'd been naive about their planning timeline. They weren't moving slowly because they were uncertain. They were being methodical, building an airtight case that would strip away my rights permanently. Once the conservatorship was approved, they'd have legal control over every aspect of my life, from where I lived to how my money was spent. That evening, I pretended to drink my coffee while actually pouring it into the potted plant beside my chair. Instead of becoming drowsy, I remained alert enough to listen when Marcus made a phone call he thought I couldn't hear. He was standing in the kitchen speaking in low tones to someone who was clearly pressuring him about his gambling debts. "I understand the timeline," Marcus said, "but the old woman is being more stubborn than expected. We might need to move to Plan B sooner than we thought." The voice on the other end was loud enough for me to catch fragments. Someone was demanding payment, threatening consequences that extended beyond Marcus to his family. The pressure was increasing, and their patience was running out. "If she won't sign voluntarily," Marcus continued, "we've discussed other options. My sister thinks we should wait, but I'm telling you, if this thing goes sideways, we might have to consider permanent solutions. The old lady has no other family, no one who'd really investigate if something happened." The words hit me like a physical blow. My son was discussing my murder as casually as he might talk about putting down a sick animal. The sleeping pills hadn't just been about making me appear confused. They'd been testing whether they could drug me without detection, possibly preparing for something far worse than conservatorship. I hung up the kitchen extension as quietly as possible and retreated to my bedroom, my heart pounding with a mixture of terror and rage. My children weren't just planning to steal from me. They were prepared to kill me if I couldn't be controlled through legal means. That night, I made a decision that would change everything. If Marcus and Janet wanted to play a game of deception, they were about to discover that their supposedly helpless mother had learned a few tricks during 65 years of watching and listening. The next morning, I drove to the bank in the neighboring county and opened a safety deposit box under my maiden name. I began documenting everything, photographing Janet's notes, recording their conversations using Harold's old radio with its hidden recording device, and gathering evidence of the systematic drugging and fraud. But I also began planning something they'd never expect. If they thought they were dealing with a confused old woman, I'd give them exactly what they wanted to see right up until the moment I destroyed them completely. 3 weeks after discovering their murder plot, I was ready for the final confrontation. I'd gathered enough evidence to destroy them legally, but I needed them to reveal their true nature one more time in a way that would make any jury understand the depths of their cruelty. The opportunity came on a Thursday evening in early November. A storm was moving across the Texas plains, bringing the kind of cold rain that made you want to stay inside by the fire. Marcus and Janet arrived together, which was unusual. They were normally careful not to appear too coordinated in their planning. This time, they'd brought Stephanie and Bradley Hutchins, the corrupt lawyer, from their notes. Bradley was a thin man in an expensive suit that couldn't disguise his nervous energy. He carried a leather briefcase and kept checking his watch, clearly uncomfortable with being at the ranch. Stephanie wore too much perfume and kept looking around my house like she was already redecorating it in her mind. They gathered in the living room while I served coffee, making sure to give myself the cup I'd prepared without any sleeping pills. The others received their normal coffee, though I noticed Bradley had brought a small flask and was adding something stronger to his drink. Marcus cleared his throat and adopted the patronizing tone he'd been using with me for months. Mother, we've brought Bradley here tonight because we need to take care of some legal matters that can't wait any longer. There are documents that need your signature, and it's important that we handle this properly. Janet spread papers across my coffee table with the efficiency of a real estate closing. The documents were thick, filled with legal language designed to confuse, but I'd learned enough over the past months to understand their purpose. They were transfer papers that would sign over the entire ranch to Marcus and Janet, effective immediately. Now, Mrs. Hayes, Bradley said, his voice carrying the false sympathy of a funeral director. These papers are really just a formality. Your children are concerned about your welfare, and this arrangement will ensure you're properly cared for while they handle the burdensome aspects of property management. I looked at the papers, pretending to study them with the confusion they expected. I don't understand why this needs to happen tonight. Can't we wait until I've had time to think about it? The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus and Janet exchanged a look I'd seen before, the silent communication of conspirators whose patience was exhausted. Mother, Janet said, her voice taking on a sharp edge. You don't have time to think about it. There are debts that need to be paid, responsibilities that you can't handle anymore. You need to sign these papers tonight, or there will be consequences that none of us want to face. What kind of consequences? I asked, maintaining my facade of innocent confusion. Marcus stood up abruptly, his bulk casting a shadow across the room. The kind where loan sharks burn down houses with people still inside them. The kind where old women have accidents that look very natural to the local sheriff. Do you understand what I'm telling you, Mother? The mask was finally slipping. Stephanie looked uncomfortable with her husband's direct threats, but she didn't intervene. Bradley took another drink from his flask, clearly wanting to be anywhere else. Janet watched with the cold calculation of someone who'd been waiting for this moment for months. I set down my coffee cup with a steady hand. I need time to read through these documents properly. Some of these terms don't seem right. You don't need to read anything, Marcus snarled. You need to sign where we've marked the papers and stop pretending you understand legal matters that are way beyond your comprehension. That's when I made my calculated mistake. I pushed the papers away from me and said firmly, I won't sign anything tonight. This is still my house and my ranch, and I won't be bullied into making decisions I'm not comfortable with. The explosion was immediate and terrifying. Marcus grabbed my wrist with enough force to leave bruises, his face contorting with rage that had been building for months. You stupid old woman, do you have any idea what you're doing to this family? Janet moved to my other side, her voice rising to match her brother's anger. We've been patient with you, Mother, but our patience is over. There are people who will hurt Marcus's children if this debt isn't paid. Do you want your grandchildren to suffer because you're too selfish to do what needs to be done? I pulled my hands away and stood up, moving toward Harold's study where I knew they'd follow me. I said no, and I mean no. This ranch belongs to me, and I won't be forced into signing it away because Marcus made bad decisions at the casino. That's when Marcus snapped completely. He walked to the closet where Harold's old leather belt hung on a hook, the same belt my husband had worn every day for 20 years. Marcus pulled it free and doubled it over in his hands, the leather making a sharp crack that filled the small room. Sign it now, old woman, or you'll get worse, he shouted, advancing toward me with the belt raised above his head. Janet grabbed both of my arms from behind, holding me in place while Marcus brought the belt down across my shoulders and back. The pain was immediate and shocking, but what hurt more was the realization that my children were capable of physical violence against their own mother. The people I'd sacrificed everything for were beating me with their father's belt. Stop fighting us, Janet screamed as Marcus struck me again. Sign the papers and this ends right now. Keep fighting and we'll make sure you never fight anything again. I let myself cry out, let myself appear broken by their assault. Please stop. I'll sign whatever you want. Just please don't hurt me anymore. The transformation was immediate. Marcus lowered the belt, breathing heavily from exertion and adrenaline. Janet released my arms and stepped back, smoothing her hair like nothing had happened. Stephanie and Bradley had watched the entire assault without intervention, making them accessories to elder abuse. That's more like it, Marcus said, coiling the belt around his hand like a trophy. Now we're going to go back to the living room, and you're going to sign those papers properly, and we're never going to have this conversation again. I nodded submissively, wiping tears from my cheeks, while secretly checking that the recording device in Harold's radio had captured everything. I understand. I'm sorry for being difficult. I just needed to understand how serious this was. Back in the living room, I sat at the coffee table with the papers spread in front of me. My hands shook as I signed each document, but I was careful to make small, deliberate errors that would invalidate the signatures. I signed Alice Haynes instead of Alice Hayes on the first document. On the second, I dated it November 10th instead of November 13th. On the third, I deliberately smudged my signature just enough to make it illegible. Bradley was too drunk to notice the mistakes, and Marcus and Janet were too focused on their victory to pay attention to details. They gathered up the papers with obvious relief, believing they'd finally broken my resistance. There now, Janet said with false sweetness. That wasn't so difficult, was it? We'll get these filed tomorrow, and you won't have to worry about any of these burdens anymore. I think I'd like to go to bed now, I said quietly. This has been very emotional for me. Could I have just one night to say goodbye to the house before you make changes? Marcus was magnanimous in victory. Of course, Mother. Take all the time you need. We'll start making arrangements tomorrow, but there's no rush now that the paperwork is handled. They left together, talking in excited voices about their plans for the ranch. I waited until their car lights disappeared down the gravel road, then moved into action with efficiency that would have surprised them. I packed a small bag with essential items, making sure to include the spare key to my safety deposit box and the contact information for Benjamin Foster, the real lawyer I'd been secretly consulting. I took only $2 from my purse, leaving everything else exactly as it was to maintain the illusion of an unplanned departure. At 3 o'clock in the morning, I walked out through the kitchen door I'd deliberately left unlocked. My old pickup truck started on the second try, and I drove through the storm toward Mary Patterson's cabin 60 miles away in the hill country. Mary was my childhood friend and the only person who knew about my real plans. Behind me, I left a single piece of paper on my pillow. Written in my careful handwriting were the words, "The real Will is where Harold's heart always was." By sunrise, Marcus and Janet would wake up to find me gone and realize that their supposedly airtight legal documents were worthless. But more importantly, they'd begin the frantic search that would lead them exactly where I wanted them to go. The game was far from over. In fact, it was just beginning. Mary Patterson's cabin sat in a valley so remote that cell phone towers couldn't reach it, surrounded by post oak trees that had been growing since before Texas was a state. Mary and I had been friends since childhood, and she was the only person who'd known about my secret preparations for the past 3 months. "Alice," she said as she helped me out of the truck rain still dripping from my hair, "you look like you've been through hell, but your eyes are brighter than I've seen them in years." Mary was 71, a retired school teacher who'd never married and never regretted it. She lived simply but comfortably on her teacher's pension and the small inheritance her parents had left her. Her cabin had no internet, no landline, and no way for anyone to track me down. "They did exactly what we expected," I told her as we sat by her wood-burning stove drinking real coffee without any sleeping pills. Marcus used Harold's belt on me and Janet held me while he did it. Every word is on the recording device. Mary's face hardened. She'd known my children since they were babies, had even taught Janet in elementary school. I never thought they'd actually put their hands on you. Are you hurt? I rolled up my sleeves to show the bruises forming on my wrists where Janet had grabbed me. Nothing that won't heal, but now we have everything we need to destroy them legally. The next morning, I used Mary's landline to contact Benjamin Foster, the real lawyer I'd been secretly working with for months. Benjamin was everything Bradley Hutchins wasn't: honest, competent, and genuinely concerned about protecting elderly clients from family abuse. Alice, his voice was warm with concern. Are you somewhere safe? I've been worried since you didn't call yesterday. I'm safe, and everything went according to plan. Do you have the FBI contact information we discussed? Agent Sarah Connor is expecting your call. She specializes in elder abuse cases and has been reviewing the preliminary evidence you provided. Are you ready to move forward with the criminal charges? I looked out Mary's window at the morning sun filtering through the oak trees. For the first time in 5 years, I felt completely free. I'm ready to tell them everything. But first I needed to explain the real situation to Mary because even she didn't know the full scope of what Harold had hidden from me during our marriage. Mary, I said, settling into the rocking chair by her fireplace. What I'm about to tell you will sound impossible, but Harold wasn't the simple rancher everyone thought he was. I explained that I'd never actually owned Sunset Ridge Ranch in the traditional sense. Harold had set up a complex trust structure during the early years of our marriage, designed to protect our assets from exactly the kind of family manipulation we were now facing. I was the trustee with full control over the property, but Marcus and Janet had never been named as beneficiaries. The real will hidden in Harold's underground bunker left everything to the Texas Wildlife Conservation Foundation, with provisions for me to change the beneficiaries only under very specific circumstances. Those circumstances included documented evidence of family members attempting to harm or defraud me. Harold built a bunker during the Cold War. I continued watching Mary's eyes widen. He told me it was for storm protection, but it was really a secure storage facility for important documents and valuables. He called it his heart because that's where he kept everything he truly valued. The bunker was hidden beneath the old cattle barn, accessible through a concealed entrance that looked like part of the foundation. Harold had shown me the location years ago, but I'd forgotten about it after his death. It wasn't until I found Janet's notes about searching for the real will that I remembered his cryptic comments about keeping important things close to his heart. What did you find in there? Mary asked. Evidence that Harold had been protecting me from Marcus and Janet's manipulation attempts for years before his death. He'd hired a private investigator to document their gambling debts, their failed businesses, and their attempts to pressure me into co-signing loans. He knew they were planning something like this. But the most shocking discovery was the geological surveys Harold had commissioned in secret. Sunset Ridge Ranch sat on top of one of the largest undeveloped oil deposits in central Texas. 3 major oil companies had been trying to negotiate drilling leases for the past 2 years, but Harold had refused all offers because he wanted to preserve the land for wildlife. The ranch isn't worth $8.5 million, I told Mary. With the oil rights, it's worth over $30 million. Harold had left video messages for me recorded shortly before his death. In them, he explained the trust structure, the location of hidden bank accounts, and his reasons for keeping these secrets from our children. He'd been testing Marcus and Janet for years, giving them opportunities to show genuine care for my welfare. When they failed those tests repeatedly, he'd made provisions to protect me from their greed. Alice, he said, in one of the videos, his voice carrying the authority I remembered from our early days together. If you're watching this, it means our children have shown their true nature. don't feel guilty about what you have to do next. They made their choices, and now they have to live with the consequences. Mary helped me understand the full scope of what Harold had prepared. There were 3 additional bank accounts I'd never known about containing over $2 million in savings and investments. An antique collection worth $800,000 was stored in a climate-controlled facility in Austin. A vintage car collection, including Harold's prized 1969 Mustang, was worth another $150,000. My husband had spent our entire marriage quietly building a fortune while living modestly, always planning for the day when I might need to defend myself against the very people we'd raised together. He knew, I said, the realization finally hitting me. Harold knew that Marcus and Janet would try to destroy me after he was gone, and he spent years preparing for this moment. That afternoon, using Mary's secure landline, I contacted Agent Sarah Connor at the FBI. She arrived at the cabin the next morning, a professional woman in her 40s who specialized in elder abuse and fraud cases. "Mrs. Hayes," she said, settling into Mary's kitchen with a digital recorder and a briefcase full of legal forms, "I've reviewed the preliminary evidence your lawyer provided. What you've documented is one of the most systematic elder abuse cases I've encountered. Are you prepared to provide a complete statement?" For 6 hours, I told Agent Connor everything. I provided the audio recordings from Harold's hidden device, the photographs of Janet's planning notes, the medical evidence proving I'd been systematically drugged, and the documentation of bribes paid to Dr. Williamson and bank president Thomas Morrison. The assault with the belt was captured on recording. I explained, playing the audio that clearly documented Marcus's threats and the sounds of violence. They were careful not to leave visible marks, but the intent was clear. If I hadn't complied, they were prepared to escalate to more serious violence. Agent Connor's expression grew more serious as she reviewed each piece of evidence. "Mrs. Hayes, you've documented a conspiracy that involves fraud, elder abuse, medical malpractice, bribery, and assault. These charges could result in decades of prison time for everyone involved." But I wasn't finished. The real trap was still waiting to be sprung. "Agent Connor," I said, handing her a manila envelope, "there's something else Harold prepared that they don't know about yet. The oil surveys show deposits worth over $20 million. When Marcus and Janet realize what they've lost by assaulting me, their desperation is going to make them do something even more stupid." That evening, sitting on Mary's porch and listening to night sounds in the valley, I allowed myself to imagine what was happening at the ranch. Marcus and Janet had probably found my note by now. They were likely tearing apart the house searching for Harold's heart, not knowing they were looking for a Cold War bunker filled with evidence of their own crimes. Their carefully planned conservatorship scheme had crumbled the moment they put their hands on me. The legal documents they'd forced me to sign were worthless because of the deliberate errors I'd made. And somewhere in their frantic searching, they were about to discover that their supposedly helpless mother had been recording their every move for months. Agent Sarah Connor's investigation moved with the efficiency of a federal task force. Within 72 hours of my statement, search warrants were issued for the ranch Dr. Williamson's medical office, Bradley Hutchins' law practice, and the bank records of everyone involved in the conspiracy. I stayed at Mary's cabin during the initial raids, but Agent Connor kept me informed through secure phone calls. "Mrs. Hayes," she said on Thursday morning, "you're going to be amazed at what we found in Harold's bunker." The underground facility was more extensive than even I had realized. Harold had built a sophisticated storage system containing not just the legal documents and oil surveys, but detailed financial records going back 20 years. He'd documented every loan Marcus had defaulted on, every business Janet had failed at, and every time they'd asked him for money while showing no genuine concern for family welfare. Your husband was essentially conducting a long-term investigation of his own children, Agent Connor explained. The evidence he compiled shows a pattern of manipulation and financial irresponsibility that spans decades. But Harold's most damning discovery was proof that Marcus and Janet had been planning to move against me even before their father's death. Text messages between them recovered from an old phone Harold had confiscated showed they'd been discussing how to handle the old man and his stubborn wife as early as 2 years ago. The oil survey reports contained information that staggered everyone involved. The geological assessment showed proven reserves worth at least $20 million with potential reserves that could exceed $50 million. 3 major oil companies, including ExxonMobil and Chevron, had submitted formal lease proposals that Harold had rejected because he wanted to preserve the land for wildlife conservation. Mrs. Hayes, Agent Connor said, "Your husband essentially left you one of the largest private oil deposits in Central Texas. The current lease proposals would generate over $3 million annually in royalty payments, while still preserving 90% of the ranch for cattle and wildlife." Meanwhile, Marcus and Janet's world was collapsing with spectacular speed. The FBI raid on the ranch occurred while they were still searching for Harold's heart-giving agents the opportunity to arrest them in the act of destroying evidence. Janet was found trying to burn her planning notes in the fireplace, while Marcus was attempting to remove Harold's recording device from the radio. Dr. Williamson's medical practice was shut down immediately when investigators found evidence of the systematic falsification of my medical records. The fake dementia reports were so poorly constructed that a first-year medical student could have identified them as fraudulent. Dr. Williamson lost his medical license within a week and faced federal charges for medical fraud and elder abuse. Bradley Hutchins tried to flee the state when he learned about the investigation, but was arrested at Dallas-Fort Worth Airport with $50,000 in cash that Marcus had paid him for legal services. Bank records showed he'd been involved in similar conservatorship scams targeting elderly clients, making this part of a larger pattern of elder fraud. Judge Samuel Peters, confronted with evidence of his willingness to approve fraudulent conservatorship petitions, chose to recuse himself from all pending cases and announced his immediate retirement. The FBI investigation into his activities was ongoing, but his judicial career was effectively over. The media attention began when local news picked up the story of the oil discovery. "Elderly woman fights back against abusive children" became a regional headline that quickly went national. Television crews arrived in Cedar Valley, turning our small town into a temporary media circus. I agreed to one interview with the local news station conducted at Mary's cabin to maintain my privacy. "I want other elderly people to know that they don't have to accept abuse from family members," I said, looking directly into the camera. "There are people who will help you, and there are legal protections available. You don't have to suffer in silence." The public response was overwhelming. Letters of support arrived at Benjamin Foster's law office from across Texas and beyond. Women's groups invited me to speak about elder abuse prevention. The Texas Wildlife Conservation Foundation reached out to discuss partnership opportunities for the ranch. But the most satisfying development was watching Marcus and Janet's complete social destruction in Cedar Valley. The town that had known them since childhood now understood exactly what kind of people they'd become. Marcus's gambling debts caught up with him when his casino loan sharks realized he'd lost access to the ranch money. Janet's expensive lifestyle crumbled when her credit cards were canceled and her apartment lease was terminated. Stephanie, confronted with the reality of her husband's character, filed for divorce and moved back to her parents' house with the children. She provided a statement to the FBI detailing Marcus's escalating violence at home, including incidents where he'd threatened her and the children when gambling losses made him desperate. Derek Janet's ex-husband discovered that cooperating with the investigation was in his best interest. He provided additional evidence of Janet's fraudulent activities, including forged checks and stolen credit card information. His testimony helped prosecutors build cases against both siblings. The most shocking revelation came when Agent Connor discovered Harold's final secret. My husband had continued his private investigation even after his death through a professional investigator named Robert Stevens, who'd been monitoring Marcus and Janet's activities for 2 years. Mr. Stevens has been documenting additional criminal activities, Agent Connor explained during one of our phone calls. Your children have been involved in identity theft, insurance fraud, and tax evasion. The evidence suggests this could add years to their potential prison sentences. Stevens had uncovered a sophisticated scheme where Marcus and Janet had been using elderly people's identities to open credit accounts and steal Social Security benefits. They'd targeted widows and widowers in nursing homes, people who had no family to notice when their benefits disappeared or their credit was damaged. Mrs. Hayes. Agent Connor said, "Your case isn't just about protecting you from family abuse. It's about shutting down a criminal operation that was targeting vulnerable elderly people throughout Central Texas." The scope of their crimes meant that federal charges would be filed in addition to state charges for elder abuse and assault. Marcus and Janet were looking at potential sentences that could exceed 20 years in federal prison. As I sat on Mary's porch that evening watching the sun set over the hill country, I felt a sense of justice that I'd never experienced before. Harold's careful preparation had protected me completely while revealing the true nature of the people I'd spent 43 years trying to love unconditionally. But the best part was still to come. Tomorrow, Agent Connor would arrest Marcus and Janet on federal charges, and I would finally be free to return to the ranch that was rightfully mine. The children who'd tried to steal my future had instead guaranteed their own destruction exactly as Harold had predicted they would. The federal courthouse in Austin had never seen media coverage like the day Marcus and Janet's trial began. I sat in the front row, wearing Harold's favorite blue dress and the pearl necklace he'd given me for our 25th anniversary, watching as my children were led into the courtroom in orange jumpsuits and shackles. Marcus had lost weight during his 6 months in federal detention. His gambling addiction had been replaced by the hollow look of a man who finally understood the consequences of his choices. Janet maintained her defiant attitude, glaring at me with hatred that made spectators whisper among themselves. The prosecution presented 6 hours of audio evidence, including the recording of Marcus threatening to kill me and the sounds of both children beating me with Harold's belt. The jury listened in horrified silence as my children's voices filled the courtroom, demanding that I sign away my property or face permanent solutions to their financial problems. "Ladies and gentlemen of the jury," Prosecutor Maria Gonzalez said during her opening statement, "you will hear evidence of one of the most calculated elder abuse schemes ever prosecuted in federal court. These defendants didn't just want to steal from their mother. They were prepared to kill her if she refused to cooperate." Dr. Williamson testified against Marcus and Janet in exchange for a reduced sentence. His medical license was gone forever, but his cooperation helped prosecutors understand the full scope of the medical deception. "They paid me $5,000 a month to create false reports showing Mrs. Hayes had dementia." He admitted, his voice barely audible. "I knew it was wrong, but they threatened to destroy my practice if I didn't cooperate." Bradley Hutchins, the corrupt lawyer, received 10 years in federal prison for money laundering and fraud. His testimony revealed that Marcus and Janet had been running similar schemes against other elderly clients, using the same combination of medical deception and legal manipulation to steal property and assets. Bank President Thomas Morrison lost everything when his involvement was exposed. His wife divorced him, his children disowned him, and he faced federal charges for financial fraud. His cooperation with the investigation helped prosecutors trace the money trail that connected all the conspirators. Judge Samuel Peters avoided federal prosecution by providing evidence against other corrupt officials, but his reputation was destroyed permanently. He moved out of state after his retirement, but the legal community would never trust him again. The civil lawsuits I filed were equally devastating. Marcus was ordered to pay $2.3 million in damages for the systematic drugging fraud and assault. Janet owed an additional $1.8 million for her role in forging documents and planning the conspiracy. Neither of them had any assets to satisfy these judgments, guaranteeing they'd remain in debt for the rest of their lives. Marcus's gambling debts caught up with him when the loan sharks realized he'd never access ranch money. His house was burned down in what police called an arson investigation, though everyone understood it was a message from his casino creditors. Stephanie's divorce was finalized, giving her full custody of the children and protection from Marcus's criminal associations. Janet lost her expensive apartment and was forced to move into subsidized housing. Her real estate license was revoked, and her bankruptcy filing revealed debts exceeding $400,000. She found work cleaning office buildings at night, a humbling fall from the lifestyle she'd maintained on credit and stolen money. But the most satisfying destruction was watching their reputations crumble in Cedar Valley. The town that had known them since childhood now understood exactly who they'd become. Former friends crossed the street to avoid talking to them. Their children's teachers removed Marcus and Janet from school emergency contact lists. Even the local diner refused to serve them. The ranch transformation began immediately after the criminal trials ended. I partnered with the Texas Wildlife Conservation Foundation to protect 1,800 acres as a permanent wildlife preserve while keeping 400 acres for sustainable cattle operations. The oil leasing agreements provided $3 million annually in royalty payments, making me wealthy beyond anything Harold and I had ever imagined. I hired 25 local people to work on the ranch at wages well above market rates. The sustainable cattle operation became a model for environmental ranching, attracting visitors from agricultural colleges across the state. The wildlife preserve provided habitat for endangered species and educational programs for local schools. My personal transformation was equally dramatic. For the first time in my adult life, I was making decisions based on my own interests rather than trying to please ungrateful family members. I took business management courses at the local community college, learned to use computer technology, and started a blog about elder empowerment that attracted thousands of readers. The romance with George Hamilton developed gradually and naturally. George was a 70-year-old widower from the neighboring county, a retired veterinarian who shared my love of animals and land conservation. We traveled together but maintained separate homes, enjoying companionship without the legal complications of remarriage. Alice, George said one evening as we watched sunset from the ranch porch, "You're the strongest woman I've ever known. Harold would be proud of how you handled all of this." The antique collection Harold had hidden was worth more than the appraisers had estimated. Vintage furniture, jewelry, and collectibles brought $800,000 at auction money I used to establish a scholarship fund for rural students pursuing agricultural education. The vintage car collection included surprises that made headlines in automotive magazines. Harold's 1969 Mustang was a rare Boss 429 model worth $250,000. A 1957 Chevrolet Corvette had been restored to museum quality. I kept Harold's favorite truck and donated the rest to a classic car museum in his memory. Marcus's federal sentence was 8 years for elder abuse fraud and conspiracy. Janet received 6 years for document forgery and conspiracy. Both were required to serve at least 85% of their sentences before being eligible for parole, and their federal convictions meant they'd never be allowed to hold professional licenses or work in financial industries. The restraining orders I obtained prevented either of them from contacting me or coming within 500 feet of the ranch. When Marcus was eventually released from prison, he moved to California and found work in a warehouse. Janet relocated to Oklahoma and worked in a call center earning minimum wage and living paycheck to paycheck. Their children? My grandchildren were better off without their parents' influence. Stephanie remarried a decent man who adopted the children and gave them stability. Derek, despite his flaws, provided a stable home for his children with Janet. None of these children would grow up thinking it was acceptable to abuse elderly family members. The broader impact of the case extended far beyond my family. Alice's law was passed by the Texas legislature, strengthening penalties for elder abuse and creating better protection mechanisms for vulnerable seniors. My testimony before the legislative committee was covered by national news, making elder abuse prevention a mainstream political issue. The documentary film, Fighting Back Alice's Story, aired on national television and won awards at film festivals. The producer donated proceeds to elder abuse prevention organizations, turning my painful experience into resources for protecting other seniors. My net worth reached $35 million when all assets were calculated, but the money was less important than the freedom it represented. I'd learned that financial independence truly meant personal independence, especially for women who'd spent their lives depending on others for security. The life lesson was clear: you cannot buy love with sacrifice, and you cannot change people by enabling their destructive behavior. Sometimes the greatest gift you can give manipulative people is allowing them to face the consequences of their choices. Standing on my porch at sunset watching cattle graze in fields that would be protected forever, I finally understood what Harold had been trying to teach me. Strength doesn't come from enduring abuse. Strength comes from refusing to accept it. 5 years have passed since that stormy night when Marcus beat me with Harold's belt, and I'm writing this from the office Harold built, but never got to use, overlooking pastures where endangered species now graze alongside my cattle. The sunrise streaming through these windows illuminates a life I never imagined possible at 65 years old. The final chapter of justice came last month when I chose not to pursue additional federal charges against Marcus and Janet. Agent Connor had discovered evidence of tax evasion that could have extended their prison sentences by another decade, but I decided 8 years of federal prison was sufficient punishment. Some people called this mercy, but I prefer to think of it as closure. Instead of seeking more revenge, I channeled that energy into the Alice Hayes Foundation for Elder Protection, which has helped over 3,000 seniors escape family abuse situations. The foundation provides legal assistance, temporary housing, and counseling services, turning my personal nightmare into hope for others facing similar situations. The foundation's success stories fill me with more satisfaction than Marcus and Janet's prison sentences ever could. Last week, I received a letter from a 73-year-old woman in Oregon whose daughter had been stealing her Social Security checks. Using resources provided by our foundation, she escaped to safety and successfully prosecuted her daughter for fraud. Mrs. Hayes, she wrote, "Your story gave me the courage to fight back when I thought I was too old to start over. My transformation from victim to advocate required learning skills I'd never needed before. I completed a business management certificate at Austin Community College, graduating at age 68, alongside students young enough to be my great-grandchildren. The technology courses were the most challenging, but now I maintain the foundation's website and social media presence myself. The blog I started, Fighting Back at Any Age, attracts 50,000 readers monthly. Senior citizens share their stories of family manipulation, financial abuse, and emotional neglect, finding community with others who understand their experiences. The comment sections have become support networks where people offer practical advice and emotional encouragement. My relationship with George Hamilton has blossomed into the kind of partnership I never had with Harold, based on mutual respect, rather than traditional gender roles. We travel together, frequently visiting his children in Colorado and my new friends from the foundation. George proposed last year, but we decided that legal marriage might complicate our estate planning unnecessarily. We're committed partners without needing government documentation. Alice, George said recently as we planned a trip to Europe, "You've become someone completely different from the woman I met 5 years ago. It's like watching a butterfly emerge from a cocoon." The ranch operation has exceeded every financial projection. The wildlife preserve attracts researchers from universities across the nation, generating additional income through educational tourism and conservation partnerships. The sustainable cattle operation has been featured in agricultural magazines as a model for environmentally responsible ranching. The oil revenue continues to provide $3.2 million annually, money I've invested in renewable energy projects and conservation land purchases. Harold would be amazed to learn that his wife has become one of Central Texas's largest private conservation landowners, protecting over 5,000 acres of native habitat. My personal growth included confronting painful truths about my marriage and motherhood. Harold's protective instincts, while well-intentioned, had kept me dependent and naive about financial matters. My devotion to Marcus and Janet had enabled their destructive behavior rather than helping them develop character and responsibility. But I've learned to forgive myself for those mistakes while refusing to repeat them. The Foundation's work includes education programs that help parents recognize when love becomes enabling and when protection becomes control. Breaking cycles of dysfunction requires honest self-examination, not just punishment of abusers. The legal consequences for Marcus and Janet played out exactly as predicted. Marcus was released after serving 6.5 years of his 8-year sentence, moving to California, where he works in a warehouse and lives in a studio apartment. His gambling addiction has been replaced by court-mandated counseling, but his earning potential remains limited by his federal conviction. Janet served her full 6-year sentence and moved to Oklahoma, where she works overnight shifts at a call center. Her real estate career is finished permanently, and her bankruptcy filing means she'll never again have access to credit or investment opportunities. Both siblings remain subject to lifetime restraining orders preventing contact with me. Their children. My grandchildren have thrived without their parents' toxic influence. Stephanie's remarriage provided stability for Marcus's children, who now call their stepfather Dad and show no interest in reconnecting with their biological father. Janet's children live with their father Derek, who despite his flaws has provided consistent parenting and emotional support. I've had no contact with any of my grandchildren, which saddens me, but seems necessary for their well-being. They're building lives free from the manipulation and violence that characterized their parents' behavior. Perhaps someday, when they're adults, they'll seek me out with questions about their family history. If that day comes, I'll be ready with honest answers. The media attention has continued sporadically over the years. Alice's Law has been adopted by 12 states, creating stronger legal protections for elderly abuse victims. The documentary about my case is now used in law schools and social work programs to illustrate effective intervention strategies. Last month, I was invited to testify before a congressional committee considering federal elder protection legislation. Sitting in that hearing room speaking to representatives from across the nation, I marveled at how far I'd traveled from the frightened woman who used to hide sleeping pills in potted plants. Representative Johnson, I told the committee chairwoman, elder abuse isn't just about individual families. It's about a society that devalues aging and treats seniors as burdens rather than resources. We can't legislate love and respect, but we can create consequences for those who prey on vulnerable elderly people. The community response in Cedar Valley has been overwhelmingly positive. The local bank under new management after Thomas Morrison's conviction renamed their main conference room the Alice Hayes Community Room. The high school created the Hayes Agricultural Scholarship funded by my foundation for students pursuing careers in sustainable farming. Even the painful memories have found constructive purposes. The belt Marcus used to beat me is now displayed in the foundation's education center, alongside audio transcripts of that terrible night. Visitors can hear exactly what elder abuse sounds like, making the abstract concept frighteningly real. Mrs. Hayes, a young social worker, told me during her recent visit, seeing that belt and hearing those recordings changed how I approach elder abuse cases. I'll never again minimize what seniors are experiencing when they report family violence. Harold's presence remains strong in my daily life, though my relationship with his memory has evolved significantly. I visit his grave monthly, bringing flowers from the rose garden he loved, but our conversations now focus on my accomplishments rather than my grief. I believe he would be proud of the woman I've become, even though it required rejecting some of the protection he tried to provide. The underground bunker has been converted into a climate-controlled archive for the Foundation's research library. Harold's Cold War preparations now preserve documentation of elder abuse cases and successful intervention strategies. The irony would amuse him. His bomb shelter became a weapon against family violence. My daily routine includes sunrise walks through the wildlife preserve, where I often encounter deer, wild turkeys, and occasionally the endangered golden-cheeked warblers that nest in our oak trees. These moments of solitude help me process the incredible journey from victim to survivor to advocate. The financial security still feels surreal sometimes. Growing up during the Great Depression, then living through Harold's careful money management, I never imagined having enough wealth to solve other people's problems. The Foundation's endowment ensures that elder protection services will continue long after I'm gone. But the real treasure isn't the money. It's the knowledge that I spent the last chapter of my life fighting for justice, rather than accepting injustice. It's the letters from seniors who found courage in my story. It's the legislation that will protect future generations from the abuse I experienced. Yesterday, I received a letter from a woman in Michigan whose son had been systematically stealing from her pension account. Mrs. Hayes, she wrote, reading about your experience gave me permission to stop being a victim. I'm 78 years old, and I'm finally learning to fight back. Thank you for showing me that it's never too late to reclaim your power. These letters arrive weekly, each one representing someone who chose strength over surrender, justice, over peace, truth, over family loyalty. They remind me that personal transformation can inspire social change, that individual courage can challenge systemic problems. As I finish writing this story, the sun is setting over the preserved prairie where buffalo will graze next spring. The Foundation purchased the herd from a conservation ranch in Montana, completing Harold's dream of restoring native ecosystems to Central Texas. Tomorrow, I'll speak to a group of senior citizens in San Antonio about recognizing early warning signs of financial abuse. Next month, I'll testify in a court case involving medical fraud against elderly patients. These activities keep me busy and engaged, providing purpose beyond my own healing. The life lesson that emerged from this nightmare is both simple and profound. You cannot change abusive people by enabling their behavior, but you can change your response to that behavior. Strength isn't about enduring pain silently. Strength is about refusing to accept what you don't deserve. I'm 70 years old now, and I'm finally free to be who I was meant to be. The frightened woman who walked away with $2 in her pocket has become someone who helps others find their own power. The ranch that Marcus and Janet tried to steal has become a sanctuary for wildlife and a symbol of hope for abused seniors. Harold once told me that everything happens for a reason, but I've learned that we create the reasons through our choices. The abuse I suffered wasn't destined or meaningful in itself, but my decision to fight back, document evidence, and seek justice transformed meaningless suffering into purposeful action. If you're listening to this story and recognize patterns from your own life, please understand that you have more power than you realize. Age doesn't make you helpless. Family relationships don't give anyone the right to abuse you. There are people who will help you fight back no matter how old you are or how long the abuse has continued. I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to stand up to family members who tried to take advantage of your kindness? What would you do if you discovered your children were plotting against you? How do you think we can better protect elderly people from family abuse? Please share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story touched your heart or taught you something valuable, please like this video and share it with others who might need to hear Alice's message. Subscribe to our channel for more stories about people who refused to give up when life seemed hopeless. Together, we can create a world where growing older doesn't mean becoming vulnerable to the people who should protect us. Thank you for listening to my story. I hope it gives you the courage to write your own ending, no matter what chapter of life you're living right now. Remember, it's never too late to fight back, and you're never too old to start over. The sun has set on another day at Sunset Ridge Ranch, but for the first time in years, I'm not afraid of what tomorrow might bring. I'm excited about it.